Under Drain 3 treatment process. And with me tonight I have Dennis Beckert, who's the section manager for our permitting section, and Jeff Bordeaux, who does a lot of the permitting for the landfill as well. My role is primarily looking at the water aspects of the landfill, so I do a lot of work with the water quality and including this under drain. And so I'll be kind of introducing the permit amendment proposal this evening, but these guys are very involved as well, and that's why they're here. Our contact information is up there, and I'll put this up at the end too. If any of you need to get in touch with us, we're more than happy to talk. So like I said, I'll be doing kind of an introduction to what this amendment is. And there's currently 2 different amendments going through for this landfill, and I just want to set the stage so we all know what we're talking about this evening. It'll be really brief, about 10 minutes. We'll have a chance to ask any questions after that, and then we'll move on to the public comment opportunity. So this amendment does have a draft certification that's out right now. And this evening, in addition to posting written comment, is opportunity for the public to weigh in on what we've drafted for the amendment, what has been submitted to us for review, and we'll take those into consideration as the process moves forward. And I'll go over at the end of this presentation kind of the approaches that you can do for making public comment. Tonight, we're looking at a treatment system for PFAS from the under drain of the landfill. And so this is, in the written documents, you may have seen it called UD3, but it is an under drain collection system that each phase of the landfill has installed when that phase has been constructed. So under drain 3 was constructed a long time ago, not recently, but we are looking at the groundwater that's collected by the under drain under this older phase of the landfill. These under drains are gravel drainage layers that are collecting groundwater that comes in from the sides and from the base. They're installed at the landfill to keep the groundwater away from the waste mass. So they're gravel blankets that intercept the groundwater before it can come in contact with the landfill infrastructure. So all of this is showing the under drain that's built underneath any of the liner system for the landfill. So starting from that dark gray line, that screened bedding soil up, it isn't shown on this diagram, but you would then see the liner, the double liner system, and then the waste mass would be above that. So what we're talking about is intercepted groundwater within that gravel drainage layer underneath the landfill. This phase of the landfill, it all drains down through that gravel layer into a pipe, which then runs down slope and then discharges that collected groundwater. This phase of the landfill, this is the pipe where it comes out. All phases of all landfill under drains are evaluated monthly for pH, conductivity, temperature, and flow rate, and that is reported to us in the solid waste program. This phase, UD3, has flows that have ranged from 4,000 to 13,000 gallons a day over the last year, so these are recent flow rates. In addition to these monthly reports that come in, we do have annual, semi-annual water quality analysis that's done. So like all the groundwater systems around the landfill in May and October, these under drain discharges are analyzed for metals, volatile organic compounds, and with the 2018 certification, we added on per and polyfluoral or PFAS compounds to that analysis. This is the PFAS concentrations from UD3 since that analysis has been happening. So since that 2018 permit, you'll see the semi-annual May and October monitoring, and the concentrations that we've seen for PFAS in this under drain have ranged from around 20 to as high as 80 parts per trillion. In Vermont, the health advisory for drinking water is 20 parts per trillion. There is no surface water standard in Vermont for PFAS, and that is what we regulate this discharge as a surface water. So when we started seeing these concentrations in the under drain, we asked the landfill to evaluate whether this was impacting the groundwater quality downslope from this under-drain discharge. So downhill from where this pipe was coming out, we do have something called the groundwater point of compliance. So in Vermont,
please. I'm sorry. Let me have I'm struggling hearing about it. I just can't.
I will speak up. Please let me know if you can't hear me again.
Thank you.
Apologies. In Vermont, we regulate groundwater at a point of compliance for facilities. This varies facility to facility type. For the lined landfill, which is the phase of the phase 3 of the landfill is lined. So in this area, we're looking at 150 meters from the landfill liner edge is where groundwater has to meet the Vermont groundwater quality criteria standards. Exceedances cannot be going across that boundary. So that is the location that we asked the landfill to install a groundwater monitoring well to see whether that under-drain discharge, which had elevated PFAS, was impacting the groundwater quality. That monitoring well was evaluated and did have concentrations of PFAS. It was evaluated 3 times. It had concentrations twice of around 5 parts per trillion for the PFAS compounds that are regulated in Vermont. And then it had a detection of 11 parts per trillion. So, like I said before, the Vermont drinking water standard and our groundwater standard in Vermont is 20 parts per trillion. We have not seen those concentrations in the groundwater yet, but we have something additionally, so not an enforcement standard, we have something called a preventative action level. And that's when facilities, if you have something detected at a preventative action level, need to take some action to prevent an exceedance of a standard from happening. The preventative action level for PFAS is 10 parts per trillion. So with that detection of 11 parts per trillion, we cross that threshold for preventative action in groundwater concentrations, and we ask the landfill to take action because of that. And so that is the treatment system, the PFAS treatment system that we're here to discuss this evening. What the landfill has proposed is a granulated activated carbon, or GAC, treatment system to be installed where this under-drain discharge is on the slope. So this is a schematic of what that would look like. GAC systems are what are used for drinking water treatment. Typically there are other treatment systems, but GAC is very commonly used for PFAS treatment and removal. And so this is basically a larger household system. The under-drain will gravity feed down into these canisters, which will all have granulated activated carbon in them, which will remove the PFAS. The PFAS sticks onto that carbon. And then the under-drain, the groundwater that has been collected, will discharge downslope out of these containers. GAC is capable of removing other contaminants as well. And this system allows for monitoring where the under-drain groundwater comes into the system, halfway through the system, and where it exits the system. So we can continue to see what concentrations are going in, so whether the under-drain is seeing any fluctuations in PFAS or any of the other contaminants that we look for, the metals and VOCs. We'll be able to evaluate the system at the midway point and the exit point to ensure that the system is removing the PFAS as it's expected to over time. So the amendment, that was the system that was proposed to us by the landfill for the treatment of this PFAS contamination that we're seeing in the discharge. The amendment, as the program has drafted it, allows for the construction and operation of that GAC treatment system. It provides for ongoing monitoring and requires reporting of the system performance, initially every other week as the system gets up and running, and that is for the suite of contaminants that we're concerned with to make sure the system is performing as needed. It does allow for decreased monitoring if performance of the system is demonstrated to be going successfully, but not less than monthly. And the amendment, as it is drafted, adds ongoing monitoring of that groundwater monitoring well that was installed at the point of compliance, because that was installed after the 2018 certification. It amends it to include ongoing PFAS and metals and VOCs monitoring at that additional location. So those are the primary components of the amendment as drafted and that we're here to comment on this evening. All of the materials associated with this amendment are posted to the electronic notice bulletin, which is our department, Environmental Conservation's primary method for doing public comments now. So if you have any DEC permit that you're interested in following, this is the way to get the documents. So it is located, you can go to env.vermont.gov to find this searchable system. It's not necessarily the most friendly system to find what you're looking for in it. You should be able to search by town. If you look for anything under Coventry, you will find this permit along with others in there. But if you search by the permit ID, OL510 is our solid waste facility ID for the landfill. So if you just put OL510 in, you will be able to find this permit. This amendment specifically is OL510 2022-2. So you would put that in that permit ID number, click search down at the bottom, and then you will see two different permits come up. One of them is this under drain amendment, which we have moved into draft certification and is ready for public comment right now. And that's the top one that's shown here. Again, you see that permit number over on the far right. The second is a proposal for a leachate management building, which would be where the potential pilot PFAS treatment systems for leachate would be operating out of. That amendment is still under consideration by our program and is not moved to the draft certification stage, which is when the public comment starts for that. So this evening is for the under drain PFAS treatment system. When we get to the point of having a full application for the pilot treatment of leachate, the building for leachate management that would go along with that, the same location is where you would go to see all the draft documents and drafted certification associated with that. And we will be holding a public comment period for that separate amendment process when we get to that point. So there's two amendments on there. You'll see you can open either of those. To open them, you have to click over here on the project name. This is where I think the system gets a little clunky, where it says landfills and treatment for both of them. If you click on that, it will open information specific to each of these amendments that are in our program right now. This amendment for the under drain treatment system is open for public comment until the end of the day, September 2nd, so another 14 days from now. Comments can be submitted orally this evening, certainly, but you can also send them in via email to me, or if you're in the ENV system, there's a comment button in the center of the screen there that you can click on, and it will do it through the system. You can attach documents or type in a comment there as well. Any comments that our program receives will be responded to through our responsiveness summary, showing how we take them into consideration as we move the permit out of the draft certification and towards the final decision. So that's the content of what the amendment is looking at, the amendment that we're talking about this evening, what amendments we have in our program currently, and how to comment. So I'm going to leave my contact information up there for the folks online for a minute, but we'll take it down. And I want to open it up just initially to any questions people have on what I went over in that presentation. And we can move on to the public comment opportunity after that. And I know there's going to be some overlap between those two different things. So if there's any general questions, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Initially, we'll deal with those, and then we'll do the comment.
Hi, I was wondering, because I've heard that the action levels...
I'm just going to pause you for a second and just make sure. Can folks online hear?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Actually, also, when you make your comment, if you could just address who you are, and then also we have a sign-in sheet that Dennis is going to pass around. If you also put your name on there, this will now be a part of the process when we have this responsiveness. We'll be able to send you the results.
I'm Polly
Yes.
Jones.
Sorry.
My first question is about the preventative action level. I had understood, and perhaps I misunderstood, that it was 2 parts per trillion, not 10, in surface water.
It is in groundwater. It is 2 parts per trillion. You are correct. I'm sorry. I misspoke. It was, until the most recent amendment, 10 parts per trillion, which is when the sampling of NWK1 was happening. So when it crossed that 11 threshold, at that point in time, the preventative action was 10 parts per trillion. It has since lowered and is now 2 parts per trillion. You are correct.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And then sort of related, I'm Peggy Stevens. So the Sanborn and Head design end of pipe standard for PFAS was to be 2 parts per trillion. As
sewage into Lake Winnebago on their side.
Huh?
We will, so folks online, you just heard someone come on, we will give you an opportunity. If you want to put in the chat that you'd like to speak, we can then do that, but we'll finish here in the room first. Sorry.
Okay. I'm just trying to clarify the numbers, because
Yes.
the numbers I'm operating in my head right now are not the numbers I heard, because the numbers you cited for PFAS levels also were much less than ones that I've seen previously documented that were excessive, way beyond the numbers you suggested for PFAS and also for arsenic and cadmium.
So the concentrations in the under drain.
Yeah.
So the concentrations I showed are the concentrations for the 5 regulated compounds in Vermont, the ones that we can control over, we have regulation authority over for groundwater concentrations. There are higher total PFAS, so the suite of PFAS that are looked at in the analysis is broader than that, and those concentrations are higher. So that is correct, that just what I was showing is a limited suite, but those are the ones we have groundwater regulations for.
Yes, just wanted to clarify. And the same for the arsenic, I mean, you didn't mention the arsenic and the cadmium.
I didn't. So there is arsenic detected in this under drain, and it's should have looked at what the highest concentration is that we've seen, but it's around 4 to 5 ppm, parts per million, that we see in that under drain, which is what we see in many groundwater monitoring wells across the facility, including wells that are upgrading to the facility and we don't believe are impacted by the facility. So, and that's in the under drain discharge itself, or what we're seeing there. At the groundwater point of compliance, that new monitoring well that was put in, the groundwater standard for arsenic is 10 ppm, and we have not seen an exceedance of that at that groundwater point of compliance. And then for the cadmium issue, if you look at the water quality tables, it is flagged as being in exceedance, so there's a highlight that they do in that, and I think that's what you've cued in on. And if you look at it, it says less than 1.73 parts per million, or whatever the concentration is for that particular sampling event. And so it is not a detection of cadmium, it is a non-detect of cadmium. The lab analysis can't get down lower than that. And so they're saying, we've looked as low as we can with our analytical equipment, and we aren't seeing any. The surface water standard for cadmium is just above where that lab detection limit has lied for the last several years. It's usually like 1.8. Depends on the hardness of the water, so the standard fluctuates too for surface waters. They're usually very close to one another. So we can't say that there is no cadmium in it because the lab equipment can't get down to those concentrations. So that's what we call it, a technical exceedance, because the lab equipment can't do it to the standard, the surface water standard that is set for the suite. So it is flagged as an exceedance.
And this lab is, I'm sorry if I interrupted anybody else, which lab is this?
I should know that, which lab these are going through.
Is it alpha
Anodyne?
Okay, who does Wade Heindel send the lab analysis through? Is it Endyne directly for all of it? The PFAS is not done directly through Endyne. PFAS is subcontracted out.
Okay, well, I appreciate your explanation. I still feel like I wish I had the document with me because it's still not totally making sense, but I'll clarify with
I am
later on.
glad to talk through that either with you this evening or any other time.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, sir.
So tell me, this system, has it been used before?
Granulated activated carbon systems are often used for a variety of contaminants, including PFAS.
And it's
We
been,
have not used it at this landfill before.
not this landfill, but other landfills?
Yes, they are used at other landfills.
And has it been successful?
Yes. Yes.
And who tests it?
Granulated, I can't name a name because granulated activated carbon is used very broadly. It's used across the board for drinking water, and that is tested by anyone that's using it. So you test any of these systems, either the operator of the system or when that's reported into whatever regulating entity
Okay,
is
so-
overseeing that.
So this system, if it's successful, will it eliminate the leachate deal?
I'm sorry, eliminate.
Will it eliminate the leachate deal, going to sewer plants, and it's not, will it eliminate that?
No, so this is not related to leachate. This is just the groundwater underneath the landfill that's collected. The leachate is all collected in the liner system above. And so this is a much smaller system than what we'd be talking about if we were discussing leachate. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Who takes the samples?
So we require that the landfill contract with a third party to do that and then to report it to us. So Heindel Environmental Management is doing the water quality analysis for the landfill right now.
Casey, we have a question online if you wanna.
Yeah.
Yeah, with, John Barrows. John, if you, yeah, we
Hi,
can.
okay?
We can.
All right, great. So you have the slide up, the amendments request under consideration, and one was the underdrain treatment system, and two was the PFAS pilot testing system. If you don't get approval for number one, could you do number two?
So they are totally separate systems. Yes, and that's why they are being considered separately for this amendment process.
Then I have one more quick question. So, for this underdrain system, you're collecting PFAS and other pollutants. Where are they coming from?
So that's an excellent question. In the underdrain, like Peggy, Ms. Stevens was just explaining, we've seen arsenic, cadmium, and PFAS. We have not seen common contaminants that are associated with leachate. So things like chloride. There's a lot of chloride in landfill leachate. It moves easily, similar to PFAS. We'd expect to see some of those other contaminants into our rules. And so if those change over time, like you're mentioning the EPA standards are changing, and if that is adopted here in Vermont, if those draft proposals become regulatory limits, our permits would adjust similarly. So our permit is structured to respond to what the standards and regulations are. And I acknowledge that those will change with time and that they are likely to decrease into the future.
Okay, given that may occur, there's every likelihood that may occur in Vermont, and given the limitations of a system that uses activated charcoal, I'm just curious why Casella, given the investment that this would entail, hasn't proposed a filtration system that includes a reverse osmosis component, given as my understanding, the increased effectiveness of that system over an activated charcoal system.
I think Casella has considered different treatment options. This granulated activated carbon is what has been proposed to us. I think it's capable of achieving the standards and regulations that we have in Vermont currently, and that's what we're looking at for this certification. If Casella wanted to propose a reverse osmosis, we would look at that amendment application and take that into consideration. But as we have drafted for the permit, I believe that the granulated activated carbon installation is capable of achieving our regulatory requirements currently.
Okay, and my last question is the system, you mentioned the system doesn't treat leachate specifically. Were this system to be constructed, where would the leachate that's collected on site end up going? Would it follow the same trajectory that it currently does, or is there some additional plan to deal with that?
So this underdrain treatment system is just for that underdrain, just for that image of the pipe that I showed, that single pipe. It is not for the leachate. The leachate is going to continue to be collected in the above ground storage tanks at the facility and transported to wastewater treatment facilities as it currently is operating.
So this proposed permit has no allowance for the treatment of leachate at all?
This permit amendment does not. This is solely for the underdrain. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Could this speaker please repeat his name?
Apologies, I don't think I actually said it. Kai Forley.
Pamela Newport, you referenced the facility for the treatment of the pre-leachate treatment. I'm curious because that's a permit that hasn't been approved. We're all waiting for further information on that, and yet you've referenced a site where that facility would be located. That's a little disturbing.
So what we have submitted to the solid waste program right now is the construction of a building that would allow for additional leachate management area, including potential PFAS pilot systems. Mm-hmm. So what we regulate is that transport of the leachate around the facility, and that's why we're looking at that construction. You are correct that the pretreatment discharge permit that was under consideration a while ago, has not been moved forward towards a final decision. But that doesn't impact our review of a building. The proposal as it is right now is that any leachate managed in that building would continue to be stored in the above ground storage tanks. Mm-hmm. It's a site where they would be able to test different infrastructure, but the ultimate management of that leachate does not change from going to the wastewater facilities like it currently is. The pretreatment permit is the mechanism that would look at that, but that is not what we're looking at with the design of the building.
It's a very convenient division that's really challenging for those of us who live here.
Yes, understood, absolutely. But I do think it's important it is confusing and there's many moving parts, but I do think each of our parts play a certain role. And so I do want to be clear that for the solid waste program, we're looking at the on-site facility management and containment and control of that leachate. The pretreatment permit is the mechanism for what happens to that for movement to wastewater facilities.
Casey, just a reminder to repeat the question.
Yes, sorry.
You were next.
I did have one question, but did you want to add to Pam's?
No.
Okay. My question to you is, you're talking about this GAC system, what are you going to do with the residuals? How is that going to be contained and prevent that from then becoming leachate?
So there are facilities that do GAC management for, so granulated activated carbon GAC management for PFAS. Some facilities regenerate it, some facilities dispose of it. And that would not be at the UCT landfill. It would be through the contractor for the GAC management.
Who is the contractor? Is it Calgon?
I do not know because we haven't installed the system.
Well, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I understand where you're, I'm sorry, I just forgot to repeat the question for those folks online again. The question was, what is the ultimate management of the GAC from the granulated activated carbon system? As things are changed out, the GAC does have to be managed for that PFAS that is down into the materials. And you should have heard my response, I hope. I think we have, yes.
I'm Effie Brown. My question is, you talked about the test well 150 feet from the actual underdrain.
From the liner, yes.
Right, the liner, okay, yes. From the liner. What is the result of the testing of the actual so-called groundwater leachate itself? Not from the well, from that liquid coming out.
So from the
and
underdrain pipe?
And flowing into the wetlands, yes.
All right. So the question from Effie Brown was whether there's been analysis of the liquid from the underdrain rather than just the groundwater monitoring well. And there has been, so that's the underdrain concentrations that I showed on, there was a little chart. We've seen for PFAS concentrations ranging from around 20 parts per trillion to about 80 parts per trillion.
And
since
that's
we've sampled that.
For
the five regulated.
five.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, 1 second. Lindy Sargent, do you still have a comment?
Hi, I'm Lindy Sargent, and I'm an advisory member of the dump committee. My question continues the vein of questioning about the GAC method. Having seen the results of both the News Vermont study and then the
I think perhaps
GAC at the top of the list, and I'm also just concerned because I'm wondering why DEC is allowing the landfill contractor, News Vermont, to make this decision instead of the agency who's responsible for the environmental health of our whole state.
So you cut out a little bit there in the middle, Lindy, so I'm going to just repeat your question. Let me know if it was not what you were trying to ask. But I think you were asking who provides the regulatory oversight of that GAC management. Is that the...
Well, I'll state it again and let me know if it's not working and I need to raise my volume. Being aware of the studies that were done by both News Vermont and the DEC, I saw that the GAC method was not at the top of the list in effectiveness. And so I'm curious why it was chosen, and since it sounds like it was chosen by News Vermont, I'm wondering why DEC is allowing the private contractor to make this decision for the health of all of Vermont and for Lake Memphremagog and the people who live around it.
I did misinterpret your question, apologies, but thank you for repeating it. The report that you're referring to, I believe, is the Brown and Caldwell leachate treatment report. And so that is looking at treatment options for the leachate that is collected from the waste mass above the landfill liner. And so that is a very different system than this underdrain treatment system. So you are correct that did not identify a simple GAC system as being sufficient to treat the leachate. That's because the leachate that's collected above the liner, that's going into those above-ground storage tanks, has a lot of other contaminants in it. This under-drain discharge does not have that high biologic loading or other contaminants present based off of our analysis. So we've seen the arsenic that we've discussed, and we've seen the PFAS. And when you have liquids that are that different, I don't want to say clean, but don't have a lot of other contaminants in it, GAC is very effective at removing PFAS. And so that we will monitor the system to ensure that it is removing the PFAS, but we do believe it will work given the concentrations that we're seeing.
And your answer to the second question I had, please?
The oversight of the...
Well, the decision on what,
yes.
which...
So our program would consider anything that was submitted to us, and we would review it to make sure that it is capable of achieving whatever, for anything, not just this under-drain system, that is capable of achieving the regulatory standards that we are looking for this to be installed again for. And in this case, this is what the landfill has proposed to us. We have drafted the certification in a way that allows us to monitor it and make sure that it is achieving those regulatory standards and believe it is sufficient. Like I said earlier, there are other systems that could do this, reverse osmosis and many others. And if those were proposed to us, we would take them into consideration as well. This is what we're looking at for this draft certification, and we have been able to move to this point in the process because we believe it is capable of achieving what we needed to achieve for the regulatory standards.
May I add a follow-up question then? If this were the treatment, the pilot treatment plan for the leachate, would that be a different system that the agency, our protectors, would be looking at than the GAC?
Correct. It would not be this GAC system that would be treating the full leachate system. So this is what we're considering with this amendment is just the installation for this under drain. It would not be for leachate, and a system of this size or this composition would not be sufficient for leachate.
All right, go straight to the back.
I think we have, yeah, one back here, and then we'll come back around.
Don McDowell from Newport Town. You've made it really clear that we're talking about under drain 3. I would assume that there's an under drain 1 and an under drain 2.
There, yes.
I would also assume that we're doing this for under drain 3 because it shows the greatest load of PFAS. Is that correct?
Yes. So to repeat the question for those online, the question was, are there other under drains at the landfill? And why are we talking about under drain 3 instead of 1, 2, and the others? So the response is that there are other under drains. Each phase of the landfill has an under drain that's been installed. So there's under drain 1, 2, 3. There's no phase 5 because that's the unlined system proposal so that hasn't been installed yet, and there is an under drain 6. So we have 4 systems there. All 4 of them are monitored for PFAS and the other contaminant, the other compounds on that semi-annual basis. Under drains 1 and 2, because of PFAS concentrations, those are the ones most immediate to the unlined landfill, are currently not discharging onto the slope and being collected, being pumped into the leachate collection system. We have the proposal for the treatment system of under drain 3, and we are monitoring under drain 6 for PFAS, and it does have PFAS detected in it. The last sampling round, the May 2022 sampling round, had 6 parts per trillion for those 5 regulated compounds detected in it. We haven't hit that regulatory threshold to require something like a treatment system at those other locations yet. So that's why we're talking about under drain 3, is because we have the concentrations, we have the known impact to groundwater quality.
So I guess my question is, given all that, then what would be your interpretation as to why under drain 3 is showing the highest PFAS if in fact we're just looking at background levels of PFAS in the groundwater, that we're not looking at contamination from the landfill?
Yeah, so the question was, why is under drain 3 the highest? And I just want to clarify that it is not the highest for PFAS. Under drains 1 and 2 have been analyzed, and they do have higher concentrations than under drain 3 did, and that's the approach for management of those is to collected as part of the leachate collection system. So those are no longer discharging to the environment. This one currently is discharging, and we have that impact to groundwater that is our preventative action limit. So they have to take some, we requested that they take some action to make sure that a standard is not exceeded, and this is their proposal for that. So there are higher concentrations in the underdrains. Those are being managed differently. This system is just for this underdrain.
And what's your sense of the source of the PFAS and those other underdrains?
It is the same as what I stated. The question, really terrible about repeating, so apologies.
That's okay. I'm just trying to get at the variability here.
The question was, what might the sources be for those other underdrains? And my response is going to be the same as what it was for underdrain 3. You know, we have a known unlined landfill that we know has high concentrations of PFAS impacting groundwater at the facility. We also have the other historic land uses, and groundwater communicates with itself across the area. And so we don't have a fingerprint that we can say, yes, this is the unlined landfill and this is something else that happened, and we're managing for the standards that we have.
Thank you.
Thank you. Brian Smith and Derby. How regular is A&R on site? Are they daily or monthly or weekly?
So the question was, how regularly is A&R at the facility? And so I can say our program is up there regularly, not daily, but when there's activities that we need to oversee, we are on site. Right now there's construction activities, and we do try and make it up every other week or so.
Every other week?
We ensure that someone is on site.
Wouldn't it behoove natural resources to be there more regular than that, considering the size of the facility?
So we are on site, but I will say that we're providing oversight through the reporting requirements of our permit as it is, and other mechanisms that is beyond that site visit. Yes, it'd be great to spend a lot of time providing oversight, but we are a limited staff. We're providing the oversight that we feel is sufficient to ensure that the landfill is meeting our regulatory requirements.
Thank you.
Based on the fact that this landfill will close.
Could you repeat your name again?
Polly Jones.
Polly Jones.
John Barrows, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
All right, based on the fact that this landfill will close, there will be a time when this landfill closes, hopefully sooner rather than later. Why go through the expense and continual maintenance of putting in this activated carbon system when you could treat this underdrain as leachate, just as in UD1 and UD2?
So the question was, given that the landfill is going to close, why install a treatment system that has ongoing management and operation rather than collect it as leachate? Is that an accurate summary? So the underdrain 3 could be collected and managed as leachate. The infrastructure is there to do that. And if there's a reason, if this treatment system doesn't work, that's definitely an approach we could take. Right now, what they've proposed is the installation of this granulated activated carbon system, and that will meet our regulatory requirements.
Yeah, okay, I'm just going to follow up on that, because we know the EPA has already set an advisory for PFAS. Pretty soon that's going to trickle down, excuse the pun, it's going to trickle down to all of us, and there will be a PFAS standard. And the state of Vermont is going to either meet or exceed that PFAS standard. We hope, right? Our green state is going to do that.
So a health advisory standard, yes.
No, we're going to have more than a health advisory standard. We're going to have water quality standard for PFAS, which we will have to do. Why would Casella go to the expense of putting in this system when they can simply treat it as leachate, which it is polluted? It could be on some levels considered leachate. We'll call it whatever we want to do. Call it. Doesn't matter. It is polluted. So what do you see as being the economical solution for this problem, rather than saying, well, Casella will put in this system now, right? But this system may not be adequate very shortly in the future. I don't think that's fair to them either. It's not fair to us, it's not fair to them.
So if I were to re-articulate that, and I'm hoping Polly will
Just
give me a nod.
see if John heard it.
Were you able to hear that clearly, John? Okay. Thank you, Polly. I think, so the discussion around what the health advisories or water quality standards or whatever may be coming in the future for regulatory limits on PFAS in any media. If they are set as regulatory limits, the landfill will have to achieve them, whether it's through this granulated activated carbon system, or if it is collecting it as leachate, or some other treatment technology. Our role in the solid waste program is to ensure that they meet those standards and that we hold them to those regulatory limits. Their approach on doing that does have to be approved by us, but we will consider any of those approaches. So what we have before us right now is this granulated activated carbon. If that proves to be not sufficient through our monitoring, or because standards change over time and it can no longer achieve those standards, we would be reevaluating other options at that point.
That answers it, but how does Casella feel about that?
I can't answer that.
Casey, I'm sorry, you got two questions online from Teresa and then John Tuttle.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, I'm Teresa, and I'm also a member of the Dump Advisory Committee. I've met some of you before. I had a question, Casey, you used an example of chloride as being something that you're not seeing in the underdrain discharge. So therefore you made a conclusion that you felt that since that wasn't in the underdrain, then the contamination wasn't coming from leachate. Is that a correct statement?
So
is that what you said? I don't want to portray you in a way that wasn't what you meant.
Yeah, no, I think that generally does summarize it. What I said is we're not seeing common leachate contaminants present in this underdrain. Things that if the leachate were going straight to that underdrain, I would expect to see there.
Right, but isn't it true that those common contaminants are forever chemicals? So they wouldn't necessarily persist for the amount of time going through soil and all that forever chemicals would. So I'm not sure you can conclude necessarily that the leachate isn't leaking into the ground in some fashion to produce this PFAS.
So like I said, we don't have a fingerprint to say where this PFAS is coming from. And what we do have to rely on is the other fingerprints that we do have, like those other leachate contaminants that I mentioned. As our understanding of PFAS improves, I can't say that we won't be able to make those connections. But this is based off of the information and the data that we have right now. My understanding is that this treatment system will be capable of removing the PFAS we have detected.
Okay. And the second question I had is just a second ago you talked about some PFAS was found in an underdrain. It was either 4 or 6. I'm not sure which one. It was 6 parts per trillion.
Yes,
is that what you
that
said?
was phase 6 underdrain.
Okay, and didn't you recently say that 2 parts per trillion is the action level?
For groundwater. And so that is...
Which is...
So the underdrain discharges are considered surface waters for our regulatory limits. And we do look at the groundwater gradient down slope of them to see where we do have PFAS standards for groundwater to see the impact. And so that 2 parts per trillion is in groundwater. The 6 parts per trillion is in the underdrain 6 discharge, which we regulate as surface water.
And do you have a monitoring well that's close to the underdrain 6 that's monitoring the groundwater down gradient from that?
We do have monitoring wells installed around the area, around down gradient of underdrain 6. We have not currently evaluated them for PFAS. This may the May 2022 results are the first time we've seen PFAS in that underdrain, and we certainly will be evaluating that going forward.
Okay, thank you very much.
And John Tuttle, do you have a question?
Yeah, I'm here, but I'm in a noisy spot with a weak connection. I wonder if you could just go to chat and look at my questions there, please.
All right. Might take a second. Do you want to ask your question, and then I'll go back to yours, John?
That's fine. I'm going to mute again. Thank you.
What I'd like to know is when did DEC start monitoring groundwater from the section, from the underdrain?
So the question was, when did our program start requiring monitoring of this underdrain for PFAS? For PFAS, it was with the 2018 certification. So it started that next spring. We have had monitoring for the other contaminants, the metals and VOCs, since installation of the underdrain.
You had mentioned that there were some chemicals that exceeded standards. Has that been consistent since you've been monitoring since 2018, that certain chemicals are exceeding the state standards?
So within the underdrain, the question was, I had made a statement that the chemicals are in exceedance of state standards. The question was whether that's been since monitoring has happened. So the underdrain, we started monitoring that with the 2018 certification. There is no standard for the underdrain. When we saw the concentrations in that underdrain, we requested the installation of the monitoring well for groundwater, which is where we have a standard. The first two sampling rounds were below the preventative action level at that time. The third one was above. That's when we had that 11 parts per trillion detection. And that was when we started this conversation about managing for the groundwater. So we haven't exceeded a standard. We've exceeded the preventative action level.
Okay. And the third question refers to something that was brought up earlier. If you are going to work to permit putting up a building here for the GAC system, and prior meetings you have said that you were considering Coventry and Montpelier. Does this mean that you've made a decision that it's going to be in Coventry? Because I assume that you're not going to turn around and have them tear the whole system out and move it to Montpelier later. So has that decision been made that the system will be installed here, and after, if the testing goes well, that this will be the site?
So the question was if this were to move to a final decision of approval and that this building and GAC treatment system were installed, does this mean we've made a decision on whether it's Newport or Montpelier? And I just want to clarify that discussion around Newport or Montpelier has been for leachate treatment, so the liquids collected above the landfill liner. And that was part of the pretreatment discharge permit discussion when that Newport versus Montpelier issue came up. This GAC treatment system is not for that leachate, it's just for this underdrain on site, just that single discharge. So this amendment does not consider the leachate pretreatment.
We got one comment online, and this is from John Tuttle. Has DEC required hydrogeologic studies of the groundwater flow velocity between the landfill site and surface water, and more generally the lake? And then his second question is regarding the GAC, how will we manage what I think you responded to, and then the estimated quantities.
So for the first question on whether we've done hydrogeologic evaluation to understand groundwater connection to surface water flow, that certainly has been done throughout the lifetime of the landfill. There's requirements before construction, and then we have the ongoing monitoring of the groundwater and surface water locations that are part of our permit, and that all informs our understanding of groundwater flow and surface water connection. And I'm happy to provide any of those hydrogeologic reports to you, and feel free to reach out for those. And if you have a specific question in there about our understanding, I'm glad to answer that as well. For the GAC management. I do think I commented on that earlier. There are a variety of options for GAC regeneration or disposal, but that would not be occurring here at the News VT landfill.
Then part of that question was estimated quantities.
I should know that number off the top of my head. It is in the application. It is going to depend on what the concentrations in the underdrain continue to be over time, but I am not drawing a number up currently, and I apologize for that.
She's next. Out back.
But we can get you that information. Like any of this, feel free to reach out to us, and I can solve my memory.
All right. Hi, my name is Frederick Bodesar. I'm with the American Conservation on the Canadian side of the border. My question goes a while back, so I'm sorry if we skipped over this topic already, but I'm not familiar with these technicalities, so I just wanted to ask you, on what basis did you decide to interpret the groundwater versus leachate situation? Like, what was the basis for this decision in your team?
All right, so the question is, how did we make that decision of groundwater versus leachate management and where these liquids are coming from?
Okay. Thank you.
So that is based off of the contaminants we're seeing in this underdrain discharge. Again, it's limited to the arsenic and PFAS exceedances, and we're really not seeing much else detected that we would expect if we had some direct leachate connection. So leachate is the liquid that is in contact with the waste mass, and that should be contained by our double liner system above the underdrain installation. Like we've mentioned, this facility does have an unlined landfill on property that doesn't have that liner system to contain the leachate. And so we do have some communication between the leachate to groundwater in that area. Is that helpful?
Thank you.
We'll get you next after.
Peggy Stevens again. I should say before, I'm also an advisory member of DOM as well, but I'd be here even if I weren't. Okay. I guess I just want to reiterate for everybody's understanding the confusion when we talk about total PFAS. So as the previous Mr. K, I can't, Forley or something, noted, there's a class of maybe 9,000 chemicals of PFAS, right? So when we talk about the measurements and whether or not they exceed the drinking water standard of 20 parts per trillion, it's only for 5. So, and then discussing the flow of up to 13,000 gallons daily with all of those other potential PFAS chemicals being there. It just does seem like it would be a grave concern, what the concentrations in the GAC might become in a short amount of time. And I know that when I was reading the Sanborn head design, it said that the GAC filters would be returned to the landfill. So if that's not the case, it's new information to me tonight because I'm just going off of what I read in the Sanborn head design. So I guess I just want to really emphasize that level of concern that the gentleman previously raised, that the potential PFAS entering the wetlands and then onto the surface waters of the Black and ultimately the lake could be much higher than the ones we're talking about tonight.